Thanks, Mary. I really like that people-centric focus. Too many of us are engineers. We think about pipes, we think about buildings, but actually all of those things only exist for people. And, pipes exist to move water for people. Buildings only work if the people are in them. If we can call the slides up now, please, over there in the tech team, that'd be quite cool. Just to give you a little bit of background, I was born in Christchurch. The place where I was born does not exist anymore. That's a good thing because it was a dangerous building. I now live in Wellington, and unfortunately we had our event about 18 months ago. I'm now visiting Mexico City, but you've had your earthquake and we won't have any problems, so I'm not the bad influence bringing things along. One of the challenges, I'm just going to bring a couple of lessons that have played out in New Zealand that I'm sure you will be grappling with here in Mexico. This building was the iconic building of New Zealand for the Christchurch earthquake. It's called the Canterbury Television Building. 115 people died in that building. There were some engineering deficiencies. They're clearly been identified in the design. That building has been inspected post the event. We had an earlier earthquake, and when we had this one, a whole lot of people died. It had a pretty dramatic impact for us, not because everyone who died was from New Zealand. We had an English language school in this building. That wiped out 40 generations of families from China because those students were from the Chinese one-child policy. So for New Zealand, that has a major impact on our education programs, our tourism, and those kinds of things. So you've got to keep thinking about the people and what happened. Very, very dramatic foreign policy issues, working with when we have international governments going, in New Zealand, some of your design deficiencies killed foreign people and no one has been held accountable. So one of the questions that always comes up after these events is who's responsible, who's going to be held accountable. And I'll give you a couple of things that have changed in New Zealand over time. What I will start with, though, is this token here. That token is 3,500 years old. It is from Babylon times, and it is called the Code of Humumbai. And he wrote over 400 laws that cover a whole lot of laws pervading to a whole lot of things, but the ones that I'm going to cover are a couple of building-related ones. And they are there, the three that I've called up. And it makes a building code very, very simple. We keep thinking about building codes being, a recent thing. But 1754 BC, nearly 4,000 years ago, the first one, if a builder builds a house for someone, doesn't build it properly and it falls down and it kills the owner, then the builder shall be put to death. I think we are not quite so brutal in today's society, but it makes the responsibility very, very clear. If the building falls down and it damages goods and he doesn't build it properly, then he shall from his own means fix it. And then the last one there is, if during construction the building does not perform, then the builder shall be responsible for making good from his own means. So those principles of the building code from 4,000 years ago, we could start to learn to apply today. And on my next slide, I think one of the biggest challenges that we've faced in New Zealand is we haven't had clarity of roles and responsibilities. And that is one of the biggest concerns. Is it the government's fault? Is it the engineer? Is it the geotech? We just don't know. And are there any lawyers in the room? There are a few. Unfortunately, if we can get this right, you will not have a job. It will be a good thing if we can be very clear that who is responsible for what, and then we do not need the lawyers. A very interesting challenge, though, that has happened in New Zealand is that in New Zealand, a legal case has made the City Council have a special duty of care for residents and residential occupiers, including apartments, in our supervision of construction. What that means is the city can be sued. Suddenly, the staff that work for me have a very, very big interest in the quality of construction, and they take things very seriously. They check designs very carefully. They check inspections very carefully. Because the city can be sued, it has changed the way that we look at construction. It has made the responsibility very clear, and we know what we've got to do. It's amazing how becoming liable makes you pay attention. Equally, the responsibilities for engineers, designers and architects have been clarified post our Christchurch event. That means that people take things seriously and properly and don't cut corners. We've also made a law change, and that's to deal with existing buildings, because all of our current laws and current codes only deal with new ones. And the new law in New Zealand that all buildings less than 1/3 of the new building standard must be strengthened to that new standard. How we're going about that is the city is doing desktop assessments, and owners can choose to either accept my staff's assessment that your building needs to be strengthened, or they can commission at their cost an engineer to demonstrate that the building is done properly. All of the strengthening costs must be borne by owners, and I know in the room there are a number of owners and developers. So the city is paying for the initial assessment, but the strengthening is paid for by owners. There are some grants and assistance available for heritage buildings, and we have declared some zones special purpose, and they have tax advantages and grants available, but if it is just a normal building, it is a building owner cost. It is the market, though, that is leading the change to bring buildings above 33%. And what that means is that tenants and business owners want to know what the rating of their building is, and it was the things that Mary was talking about. It's the consumer response. Hopefully the next. So what we see now is signs like this around the city, where this is I'm sorry, the picture's in English, but it's an advertisement for the leasing of a building, and part of the advertisement is the seismic rating of that building. And consumers then are choosing. I'm not sure what happens in Mexico, but in New Zealand, if we change the law, it tends to be something to debate and we're all going to argue about. But if the market makes a change, things happen much more quickly. So what we have now is tenants and businesses are saying, I won't be in this building, or I won't eat in this restaurant because it is not safe for me to be there. It is amazing the power of the market and how we can move things. The next big lesson that we've taken away in New Zealand is about the integration of all the disciplines, and a number of other speakers have spoken about this. It's not just about the hard science, it's the social policy, it's the cultural heritage, it's the environmental issues that all need to come in. And what happens now is that we cannot afford to operate in our silos any longer. We have to understand all of the disciplines, we have to learn to work together. And I'll try and give a couple of examples of that in a moment. So this map here, and I know a lot of people have had maps before, this map, the reds and the greens and the yellows are showing the seismic risk of my city of Wellington. The pink areas are the areas that our heritage team have declared is where they want to protect the heritage zones. Now what that means is, got very loud very quickly, what has happened here is that our older buildings are built on the better land of Wellington City. And we are now having to have a very, very tough community discussion about what buildings we are going to protect because they are heritage buildings, what buildings are dangerous because they are old, and where we are going to allow reconstruction to happen in the new areas where the land is good and not on the high risk areas. For all of us involved in this kind of work, we need to be able to have these kinds of discussions. For me to put this map in front of my councillors, my elected officials, and they can then see very clearly where's the areas where we need to have the hard discussions. This is about integrating the information from lots of disciplines. Hopefully now, this video, if the team can hit play. I'll let this video play. It doesn't have any sound and describe. This video was made for us by Canterbury University in Christchurch following the Kaikoura earthquake. One of the things that we have to be able to do as experts in this area is tell a story, because we have very complicated reports and files and no one can really understand what's going on. Our most recent earthquake originated in Christchurch, 7.8 magnitude, about 200 kilometres away from Wellington. In the top corner you can see some hypothetical models of buildings. About a minute after the earthquake first struck, the building started to move through Wellington. In this case, it was very interesting. This earthquake was very unusual in that it moved up across multiple fault lines, and the energy actually increased as the seismic waves moved up the country. For me to have videos like this was very helpful in explaining to our citizens what happened and why did things happen. The next video, if we can jump to it, and the sound may or may not play. Okay. One of the challenges that we had in Christchurch was in Wellington was explaining why some buildings collapsed and other buildings did not. And in particular, we had a very big program of strengthening unreinforced masonry buildings.
When an earthquake hits, the ground starts moving, and you'll get.
Can we start it from the beginning with the sound, please?
Very short, sharp. This is basically a structural engineering toy built with the intent of showing how buildings behave in earthquakes. And so we have the three models here, if you like. This one representing a short, stiff building, and obviously taller, medium-rise, high-rise building, a lot more flexible. Now what happens when an earthquake hits is the ground starts moving and you'll get different forms of shaking. If you get very short, sharp shaking, you'll find that the small buildings are affected. And on the other hand, if you get very long, slow shaking, you'll find the tall buildings are affected. Or, fairly obviously, something in the middle, and you'll get those buildings going. Now what's interesting about the Kaikoura earthquake, in Wellington at least, is that it basically got these middle-sized buildings going. And that's why we've seen damage in some medium-sized buildings, but not, as many people expected, in the earthquake-prone buildings.
Thank you. We can jump back to the presentation, please. Okay, so that was very helpful for me. For the structural engineers in the room, we know this stuff. We know about things called building periods and site periods and soil dynamics and all those sorts of things. But explaining to the public how the buildings responded, a video like that one of my colleagues made was very, very helpful, putting out into the media why we had different damage. As I understand from your most recent earthquake, you had a very similar response. It was those middle height buildings of a certain age on certain soil types that were the most impacted and the most damaged. Helping us technical people tell these kind of stories using simple videos like that is really, really critical. Look, to conclude, my kind of 3 points. The first one is around we need absolute clarity of responsibility. And if we have that absolutely sorted up front, then we know who is going to do what and who's going to be held accountable for what. Much more recently, this whole resilience focus and forum, we need to be much more clearly of integrating the engineering, the science disciplines alongside the social policy and economics disciplines. It is no longer okay to stand up and just talk about buildings or talk about pipes or talk about social deprivation. We've got to be much more integrated in our approach, and forums like this are fantastic for doing that. And finally, I'll leave you with some words from our native language at home from the Maori, which is he tangata, he tangata, he tangata. It is the people, the people, the people. We must always remember that to put people at the centre of all of the planning and all that we're doing. Hopefully that's given you some things to think about.